Okay, today we're going to talk about Chapter 8, Lesson 3 and 4. So first of all, for Lesson 3, let's see, we're going to talk about the Alexander the Great Empire starting. It actually starts before that with his dad. So Philip II of Macedonia, you can see on the map there, Macedonia or Macedon was to the north of Greece. And as a young man, Philip had lived in Greece for a while and admired the Greek culture and their military skill. So when he became king, he decided he was going to unite the Greek city-states, not by asking for like an alliance, but instead to like take them over or basically make them help him. And he wanted to unite them all and go against the Persians, who were the big empire at the time. So he teaches his army how to fight like the Greeks, and he has a very strong army, and so he goes and starts taking over city state by city state. Many of the city states were pretty weak at this time and divided after the Peloponnesian War, so they weren't able to put up too much of a fight. Athens and Thebes and a few others eventually, when they realized what was happening, tried to unite, but it was too late, basically. He fought well. He also was smart, and sometimes he didn't fight. He bribed them to surrender, or some just voluntarily gave up. So he didn't actually have to fight them all. But he does um, win over Greece. But unfortunately, he's killed before he can actually go now and go against Persia. So that will be up to his son, Alexander. So Alexander takes over when he is 20, and that's pretty young. However, his dad had made sure he was raised to lead. He's been in charge of an army. He's been a commander since he's 16, and he has a lot of respect of the soldiers for his skill and his bravery. We're going to talk about the war with Persia pretty quickly. I'll just talk about two of the more famous battles. The Battle of Granicus is the first one where Alexander goes against the Persians, and because of their skilled army and especially their cavalry, right, which you should probably know, cavalry is the soldiers that are on horseback, and they do very well, and they're able to crush the Persians in this battle. And then about a year later, they have another huge battle, and again, they're forcing the Persians surprisingly back, right? So at Isis, Darius III is the leader of the Persians who is forced to retreat. So instead of following Darius back, he decides to move south along the Mediterranean coast, and he takes over Egypt. He later builds a major city there and names it after himself, Alexandria, and it becomes this bustling city of trade and center of business and then learning later. And then, to make a long story short, you can look on the map, right? He goes to Mesopotamia and he takes that away from the Persians, and then he keeps going after Persia. And you can see this is a lot of fighting and a long time. And basically, to make a long story short, as you can see all those arrows, eventually when they get to about northwest India, his soldiers refuse to go anymore. They said they're tired. They've been, fighting constantly for years, and they want to go home. So he says, okay, and they decide to make their trek home. Of course, they're pretty far away, right? And they go through a desert in Iran, and it's really bad. A lot of his men die on the way home, crossing that desert. It's, hot and thirsty. There's a story in there about even though they're all, starving and having all this hardship, there's a story supposedly that they found a little bit of water in a helmet and they gave it to him, being the leader, and he said thank you, but then he poured it out to show that he wasn't better than anyone else and he would, be one of them, right? So they respected him, and supposedly that made them, keep going. Anyway, they do eventually get home, or they go to Babylon, is where they end up, and his health really took a beating between all the fighting and that long journey through the desert, and he gets this fever he can't shake, and he ends up dying at only 32. Okay, so he leaves a huge empire and a legacy, though. Um, he is well known and becomes Alexander the Great in history, right? Because he successfully beats the Persians and takes over this, makes this humongous empire. But he also, it's how he does it. He was said to, ride ahead of his soldiers into battle and fear nothing, and go into all these unknown places without worry. And so he was really looked up to and respected. And they think part of the reason might have been is because he was trained in this idea of reading Homer's works about all the Greek heroes, like Achilles was supposedly his favorite, and he would try to model his behavior and bravery after those stories. So that is supposedly why he acted the way he did. Anyway, so after his death, this new era is called the Hellenistic era. Hellenistic means like the Greeks. So that idea of being like the Greeks is what the future generations tried to instill. So the next kings, the Hellenistic kings, would hire government workers who spoke Greek, and they wanted builders to build cities that looked like Greek cities, and they would hire them from the architects and the artists and everyone from Greece or Greek speaking cities. And he encouraged the Greeks and other Macedonians to go into these new conquered lands and spread their culture, so that we see a big spread into places far away like India and in Egypt. And so, like I mentioned, this city, Alexandria in Egypt, becomes this center of learning. It is a very wealthy city because of all the trade, where it is right there on the coast of the Mediterranean. In the picture here, you see there's a huge lighthouse built, and this lighthouse was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Being It was so huge, and right, the flame is supposed to help the sailors, right? That's the whole point of a lighthouse. Also in Alexandria, there was a library that was known to be the best library, about 500,000 scrolls there. And so Alexandria is the center of learning, and there's a museum. So people from all over, these scribes and things, would come to learn, okay? All right, and then let's continue on with that idea in chapter 8:4, which is about that Hellenistic culture. So what was that culture that was getting spread throughout Alexander's empire? Well, like I said, they wanted to build their cities to reflect that Greek kind of building and look like Athens. So there's a lot of building projects and money spent on rebuilding things in the Greek style, temples and theaters and baths and things like that. They would import these sculptors, these Greek sculptors, and they were supposed to be, just as great as like the Golden Age, right? There was a new style, though, that developed during this Hellenistic time period, where the sculptors, remember how they used to be like trying to make everything ideal beauty and perfectly, looking perfect? Well, this new Hellenistic sculpting is more realistic. And so it's okay to show expressions. I don't know if you realized all the statues we've been looking at before didn't really have any kind of expression on their face, right? Pretty blank. And so now it's okay to show expression. So we see for the first time anger and sadness and things written, sculpted. The other thing is there's an explosion of writing taking place. One of the more famous pieces that you may have heard of was Argonautica, or you may know Argonautica as Jason and the Argonauts. It's kind of like a take on it. Maybe you've heard the story about they're looking for the ram with the golden fleece. I have that for you in an Edpuzzle, but Apollonius is the one who wrote it, and it's still read today, so it's kind of amazing. Um, and also, theater is going to grow and flourish during this Hellenistic time. And again, there's a slight change, though. Just like the Greeks, they thought it was very important, but they kind of changed the comedy, and it's called New Greek comedy. And instead of poking fun at political leaders now this remember, comedy wasn't necessarily like haha funny comedy. It was about like a positive ending, right, versus tragedy. So in this New Greek comedy, they're focusing more on the love and relationships of ordinary people, not focusing so much on political leaders. Okay. um, Menander is maybe probably the most famous. You may not know him, but he influenced a lot of comedy in Europe and the Renaissance, and even today they say they see a lot of influence from him. Okay. All right, philosophers continued to be a big thing too. The study of philosophy. There's some new types that developed during this Hellenistic time. Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus. He thought that people need to focus on happiness and avoid things that will make you worry. And that's how you can avoid pain, right? So spend time with your friends and kind of live a simple life. If you don't want a lot and you have a simple life, then you'll be happy, and it'll help you to avoid that worry. Today, we tend to think of it as also like physical things, like having good food. Notice you may have realized that Epicurean is our food provider right at school. So you may have noticed that it's actually a very clever name, right? Making you happy by having, simple, nice things. Stoicism is the next kind of philosophy I want to talk about. It actually started by a man named Zeno. Zeno is a Phoenician who had no money, and usually you would go and rent out a lecture hall to teach. And he didn't have that money, so he used a building that, and he would tell people, "Oh, it's at that building with the painted porch." And a stoa is the Greek word for a porch. So the philosophy, instead of being named after him, it got to be, the people that go on that porch. And so Stoicism is the followers. And Stoicism is that you should not let your emotions rule you, because if you do, then you'll be unhappy. You should use reason. And if you let reason guide you, then you will have better decisions, and you won't get so affected by things. And so today, when you hear the word stoic, like someone's facial expression being stoic, it's someone who's not showing a lot of emotion, right? Not showing they're affected like joy or sadness or anything. So that comes from that idea of philosophy. And also, one difference between these two is that Stoicism believed that you should serve your community, though, whereas Epicureanism was more about just, relax and spend time with your friends and avoid worries, whereas Stoicism did not think that. They thought you have like a duty, it's part of your job to serve the community. Okay, let's skip over to talking about science and math. So science, first of all, we're going to talk about some of the famous people and things that they did. Aristarchus is one of them. He figured out that the sun is the center of the universe and the earth circled the sun. Now, of course, the astronomers of his time thought he was crazy and that the earth was the center. So he did not, they did not agree with him, but he did try that. Eratosthenes is another one, and he was a chief librarian in Alexandria, so obviously a very smart guy and center of the learning. And he knew that the earth was round, and he tried to measure the circumference of the earth, right, the distance around the earth, and he got it pretty darn close. Imagine, with the technology they didn't have back then, he got it within 185 miles, so that's pretty impressive. Now, he also tried to measure how far the sun was and the moon. And he did not do that as accurately, unfortunately. But he did know that the sun was much larger than the earth and the moon. So he did have that right. So he was making a lot of strides. Euclidean geometry, you may have heard of before. He wrote a book called The Elements. And in Elements, he was focusing on plane geometry, which I'm sure you know is all the lines and circles and points on a line and angles. Sorry, I said circles. It's really not. It's about plane figures, right? Angles and lines. And so he taught that and he wrote all that down. So we know he figured all that out. Euclidean geometry is still used today, so extremely long influence. Archimedes is the second guy here. Archimedes was a very, very smart guy, and he was a scientist, he was a mathematician, he was an inventor. He focused more on solid geometry, right? Like 3D. So we're talking solids, right? So spheres and cylinders, things like that, right? And he also figured out the value of pi, which no one has ever been able to improve on. He realized it was a ratio, right? I'm sure you know pi, 3.1416, blah, blah, blah. The value of pi is what you use when you're trying to figure out the area of a circle, right? Remember, it's a ratio of the diameter by the radius. So, I'm sorry, the circumference is divided by the diameter is what I'm trying to say. And it's because it's a ratio, it's the same for every single circle. And so he realized that. And so that's kind of amazing. He was also a studier of physics. So he explained the lever and the compound pulley. And so we get a establishment of physics as a science. He also was a major inventor. He did a lot for some machinery. Like I've heard that possibly he's the one who made something called the Archimedes screw, which helped bring water up and maybe even was used in the Hanging Gardens. He also did a lot of war weaponry. The catapult was one they mentioned in your book, and how, being able to throw rocks and arrows or spears much farther distances would be helpful in war. It's a sad story that his city was attacked when he was here helping with this weaponry for the Romans. We're not quite talking about the Romans yet, but he ends up dying when the Romans surround them, and they were able to drive him back for a while with his catapults, but then eventually they capture the city and then they massacre everyone inside as punishment, and Archimedes was killed. So short story there. We're going to be done with the Greeks. The four kingdoms after Alexander, even though they had a common culture and everything, they couldn't work together. They fought amongst themselves. They couldn't keep all the Greek city-states under control. And so eventually, like I just said, Rome is going to come in and take over and be like the next big controller of everyone. We'll talk about that next time.